All right, everyone. Well, welcome. My name is Sarah Kurtz McKinnon. I'm the co-founder of the Summer Camp Society, and I go by Kurt. So you're welcome to call me that. And I use she, her pronouns. I am so glad everyone is here for getting staff feedback and fielding staff complaints. Every week for Summer Camp Society, we meet with a group of people that we call our members. You can join it too if you haven't already. And one of the things we heard a lot last fall was that people had a hard time maybe accepting or understanding or processing or dealing with staff that would bring things to the director's attention. And it kind of became something that I think contributed to a lot of director burnout and confusion over the course of last summer. So we talked to a lot of different camp directors about how they handled this kind of challenge and put together some really actionable ways that you can better manage staff feedback and fielding staff complaints. And I am recording. So if you do have to step away, I understand. This is scheduled for an hour and a half. We'll see how long it takes us to get through everything. Okay. All right. There's a cute picture of me at camp when I was a kid. There's our Summer Camp Society group at our most recent retreat in New Jersey, which was an awesome time. And there's a picture of me looking clean and professional. So I'm not so sure what else you need on that slide, but there it is. Okay, so I want to ask the group, especially if you've been in camping for like around 5 years, how has staff feedback changed over the past 5 years? Have you noticed any trends, new, approaches to feedback from your staff? What have you observed from your experience? Any thoughts?
Hi, I'm Kate.
Kate.
I feel like so I was a counselor, like a young counselor, and then recently I've joined the leadership team. And there's been a leadership change. Our previous directors have been directors for like 30 years and they retired. And so it's hard to say, like, I think what I've noticed is that maybe feedback, it was like more, I don't know that many people approach the previous directors. There's just like more of a distance. And now I think like there's a younger leadership staff. And so people are very comfortable like sharing things, which is great. But I also think the content of the feedback has changed. So things that are like really, that don't make a lot of sense sometimes, like it feels very, like I can't really help you with that kind of questions. And then a lot of requests for like time off, more time off, and more kind of just, increased pay, which are all super valid. But that definitely, I think, has gotten more and more prominent.
Yeah, I think those points are really kind of like on trend, what I've been hearing anecdotally too, Kate. So thank you for sharing those. Any other observations about how staff feedback has changed?
Hi, I'm Drew.
Hi, Drew.
He, him pronouns. I would say one of the things I've noticed is I feel like staff are much more willing to like give feedback, but it's usually mostly critical as opposed to like encouraging or like positive feedback. And B, there seems to be a lot more push for like immediate attention or immediate like resolution to some of the feedback. So maybe not as much like, I guess, education around like the processes that it takes to kind of fix some of those things. So not understanding some of the processes at camp and expecting like immediate results to the feedback because they're like, well, you asked us for feedback. Here's the feedback.
Okay.
Now do something tomorrow.
Yeah, that can be tricky for sure. Okay, thank you. So I've compiled some anecdotal evidence. Like there isn't a lot of like you can't Google this question, right? Like how has camp staff feedback changed? But it's just something people are feeling, right? So in the course of the past 6 months or so, I've tried to talk to a lot of camp directors and collect anecdotes like the ones that Kate and Drew shared. So here's some of the things that we've noticed. So if we think about Gen Z camp staff, right? And not everyone in Gen Z is the same. It's not a monolith, right? So this isn't necessarily fair. I'll say that to start. And I will say staff right now approach their jobs differently than how I approached my job as a millennial when I was a camp counselor, and folks in Gen Z or our current camp staff that might be late high school or college age or early 20s have gone through kind of similar world experiences or witnessed a same set of similar world experiences, right? So they're maybe some of the lessons or things that have happened in their young working life have been very different than what might have happened in a person's young working life 10 or 15 or even 5 years ago, right? So some of this is borrowing from trends in other industries. Some of this is what we've noticed in camping. And if you have your video on and you want to give me like a little nod, if this is something that you've observed, that would be interesting to see if these trends are in alignment with your personal experiences. So we've noticed that camp staff today seek organizations that align with their values. So they don't really want to go work for the man, which is good. I mean, that's good for camping, right? Like, this is not like, oh, this is all bad and scary. This is like, okay, some of this stuff we're already set up for. They value a ton of organizational transparency. Is this something that you've noticed? And I think social transparency too is really interesting. Just like knowing all the things about all the things is something that perhaps that they want. Gen Z camp staff might be likely to speak up when they disagree. Is that something that you've noticed with a chunk of your staff? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe depending on the person. They tend to advocate for their personal needs. Okay. I've also heard from many seasoned camp directors that current staff can be fierce. Is it fiercer or more fierce than previous camp staff generations? Obviously, it's going to be different with your camp culture, the people that you've hired. You know, there's a whole soup here. We're talking about it's not just everyone does this one thing, but I hear more stories from camp directors who maybe receive feedback that can be very, very harsh. Like there's no kind of frosting or sugarcoating on the feedback. Is that something that you've noticed, that there can be really straightforward and perhaps fierce feedback? Okay, so we can't just float by with what we've been doing, and we need some strategies to work together, because feedback can be really helpful, right? We don't want to like shut it down as much as we may hope that sometimes it doesn't come our way. Oh yeah, Lindy says bold. Okay, like, yeah, that's a good word, right? Maybe surprising sometimes. So our goals with feedback are aligned, I would imagine. We want to collect feedback from all different stakeholders, because we want to make camp better for the kids, staff, and community, right? We also want to make sure staff know that they're respected, and we want our staff to like working here, right? We want them to return. We want them this to be like a really generative experience. If you're in other seminars with me, you've probably heard me say this many times, but my friend Maggie once told me that camp is like a video game. And when you're a camper, it's like you're in level 1 of the video game, and it's so much fun and you're really enjoying it. It's so challenging. And then you get to be like a counselor in training, and it's next level, level 2, it's harder, but it's even more fun. And then you get to be a counselor, and it's so fun and it's so rewarding, and it's so challenging at the same time. And we want to maintain that challenge, but we also want to maintain that like great experience for staff. Like I was a camper for a long time, but being a staff member was a much more formative experience for me. I think some of the work that we do as camp leaders and camp directors actually impacts our staff way more than it ever impacts the kids. And that's kind of like a secret of camp, that a lot of the youth development happens with young adults, as well as the kids. And we want it to be a great experience for them. And we want them to come back because they're the ones providing that experience for the kids as well. The other feedback goal I have for this presentation is I want you to be able to protect your own health and stamina as a leader, right? It can be exhausting fielding random bits of feedback. It can be exhausting fielding bold feedback, or kind of like what Drew was saying, like feedback where people don't have the full picture, don't quite understand, or maybe make demands that can't be met, and then there's a division. Or I have one camp director friend that always talks about her biggest fear at camp is she's going to get canceled. I don't even know if that's like very 2019. Maybe people don't even do that anymore. Rosie's cat is amazing. It's like an extension of your body right now. But you don't want to live in fear of like messing up and then getting a bunch of staff complaints and the whole staff turning against you or against the camp or leaving. I'll also say not all of this is new, right? Like my staff, this was like 10 years ago, they used to have a chant, and it's mostly silly, but there was a little bit of a threat behind it. And they would all get together and they would chant, "You can't fire us all. You can't fire us all." Right. Like, which was true. I couldn't. So if they all kind of got together and wanted to do something, I couldn't fire them all. But we want to create a culture where feedback makes sense, where it's generative, and where it doesn't wear you down, and where people are heard and respected, but have an understanding. We also recognize that you have so many other things to do. And so fielding staff feedback and complaints isn't like 100% of your job, right? So we also want to be really reasonable with it. Any questions so far? Does that make sense? Okay, great. All right, so we have 3 levers if we think about how do we make staff feedback and complaints more reasonable and generative. First off, we're going to talk about cultural mechanisms. So how do we have a healthy feedback culture within, is that Bernard's baby? Oh my gosh. You might have to turn off the blurry background for a second.
I think you're doing it now.
Amazing. I can't continue. Oh my gosh. Welcome. The feedback is good on Bernard's baby. I'm so pleased to meet her. Is it Hazel? Is that right? Or Harper?
Hazel.
Hazel, hi. You're our favorite participant. Oh, so sweet. Congratulations, Bernard. Gosh, between the cat and the baby, I'm surprised I'm still going.
You're killing it. Okay, I'm
session
gonna
might be over. Okay, so cultural mechanisms are thinking about how is feedback a healthy piece of our culture, right? So this isn't just like single instances, and how can we create a good culture around feedback at our camp? The second lever is thinking about your own leadership skills. So how do you welcome feedback, but also keep it reasonable for yourself and others? And then the third one is really, really tangible. So we're going to talk about very concrete feedback strategies that you can use to solicit feedback in a way that's more structured instead of like the sneak attack feedback that might be like hurtful or not useful or like derail a bunch of things that you're doing. Okay. All right, so cultural mechanisms. I will also share these slides after too, so don't feel like you have to take a bazillion notes. Okay. The first point I want to make around a cultural mechanism is transparency from above whenever possible, right? So the old style, and by old, I mean like 5 years ago, the old style way of making a decision at camp would just be like saying what the decision is. The new style has to be greater transparency around anything that's not confidential, right? But you can do this in many ways. You don't have to have a staff meeting about every single decision, but maybe even like writing out your logic behind something or updating people on the steps along the way on like a bulletin or in a message that everyone can read, or just something that hangs up on the wall is symbolically really valued, right? So let's say you're thinking that the fire drill that you do at the beginning of the camp, this is a random example, I just made it up, let's run with it. Let's say you do a fire drill on day 2 of every camp session, but you're thinking about changing that to day 1 of every camp session because you think to yourself, what if there's a fire on day 1? Okay, like very reasonable change you might be making. Is it possible that your staff team might be upset about this? Yes, they might be, because maybe it's a tradition to do the fire drill on day 2, right? Like maybe they weren't consulted. Maybe they think the fire drill is too scary to do on day 1, and they're going to have a bunch of campers whose homesickness is exacerbated because now they're afraid the camp is susceptible to fires. Like who knows? So if I'm thinking about changing this, I might need to announce that I'm thinking about it even earlier, right? Or if I am going to change it, I might need to, instead of announcing that I'm going to change it and like one reason why, I might need to kind of detail out my process, like who I talked to, what my logic was. So thinking about not just like laying down decisions, but showing the reasons behind decisions at all junctures is going to be important. And then during staff training, kind of setting expectations around transparency. Like I always say at camp, like I'm happy to show any of you the budget if you'd like to look, right? Happy anytime, just let me know. I'm happy to show you whatever elements of the budget you'd like to see. Maybe if I have a family owned business, it's different, but we were a nonprofit. Like, I don't care if they really want to see the budget, they can see the budget. But then I might say, but there's some things on the other side that I can't tell you about. And here's why, right? So I can't tell you certain HR things about firing or hiring. I can't tell you certain things about camper situations due to privacy and confidentiality, right? But can I have a little talk or training during staff training about what I can't tell people and why, so they don't get stir crazy because some counselor got sent home and they don't know every single detail of the story, right? And so if I tell them the legal reasons why I can't share certain details about like a firing decision, then I'm not letting their expectations down in the moment when it actually happens. The expectation has already been set. So does that make sense from a transparency standpoint? Any questions or comments about that? Okay. Also, debriefing experiences is part of practice, like your practice at camp makes a lot of sense. So a lot of us are very used to debriefing like low ropes or, team building exercises, but can we debrief a lot of things? So let's say we change the fire drill to the first day of camp instead of the second day of camp. Can we have a little staff huddle or with anyone that wants to join and just debrief that experience, just as we would debrief something that happened at the climbing tower, right? Like, what went well? What did you learn? What would you change? And really thinking of it as a debrief is a tool, and calling it that is a tool that we already have, right? Or debriefing the session or debriefing the evening activity, right? In small groups or large groups, using a debrief is a structured way to get feedback right away, where you kind of control the questions, or whoever the leader is controls the questions. And the agenda is more about like improving and growing than it is about complaining. Because when feedback or conversation around a change happens in an unstructured way, that's when it's more likely to do that like toxic spiral of it sucks here, right? Talking about feedback a lot during training and collecting it during training and making changes during training is going to be an important cultural precedent setter. So we'll talk later on about ways that you can collect feedback during staff training. But thinking about, you're setting the tone for what feedback means and what's done with it and how it's accepted. And a lot of the feedbacks during staff training are like pretty low stakes. Like, we want more coffee after lunch. Sure. Like, I can make that change. So thinking about ways to start it from the beginning in a proactive way instead of a reactive way when everyone's getting like kind of sticky and annoyed 30% through the season makes more sense. And then again, kind of like what Drew said earlier, when we're setting those expectations, that constructive feedback is very welcome and sought after, but it can't always be implemented, right? Like, I will do my best to hear you and explain to you why if we're unable to do something that you suggest and give you an opportunity to think of another way that we could come up with a better solution, right? So helping people understand from the very beginning that the answer isn't always yes, but you still want to hear it is going to be important too. And building on that, our friend Anna Hopkins at Friends Camp in Maine has something that she calls at her camp a culture of one possible solution. So this is something that they talk about, they articulate during staff training, that whenever anyone comes with a complaint or change or feedback on something, they also have to come with one possible solution. And so I think this is like a very powerful thing to institute right away during staff training. And at her camp, the staff believe in it so much that they'll actually like correct colleagues who come up with something or come up with a complaint that don't bring one possible solution into the mix and like demand one possible solution. It doesn't have to be a great solution, right? But it has to be a step in a better direction. So if you're going to complain about something, you need to think about one way that it could be better. And so that takes a lot of the fixing onus off the admin or leadership team and puts it more on the people on the ground who like know what's going on and can make suggestions and maybe make some think twice before they come up with a complaint or a concern, because they have to at least spend a minute thinking about how they could potentially make it better. So saying this, articulating it, practicing it during staff training, and even when someone comes up with a verbal complaint during staff training, to say, okay, like, thank you for bringing that up. What's one possible solution that you could imagine or would bring to the table as like the first question after someone brings up a complaint, I think is like a very powerful cultural shift. Questions or comments about one possible solution or this kind of cultural piece? Okay. Great. No more babies or cats? No. Okay. Great. Okay. So the second piece is leadership. Oh, we're going to go find the cat. Yes. On the little laptop bag. Amazing. Okay. So leadership skills is kind of thinking about what you do as a leader to make feedback healthy and healthy interface between yourself and your team. Right. So one thing we've heard a lot of camp directors do that really work is hold very regular office hours, preferably not in your office. But we know a lot of camp directors who make it very clear that like every day in the half an hour before breakfast, they're going to have their coffee at like a certain spot on the camp, right? Like, come talk to me anytime. Like, people know that that's a time when you're approachable, you're ready to meet. A lot of times people won't go to office hours, or they'll just like stop by to visit, but making it very clear when is a good time to approach you is really helpful for feedback. I know when I was a first year, second year counselor, I would have been like kind of scared to go into the camp director's office, or like not have known if they were busy or not, or never, if I knocked on the door, it would have been like an emergency situation, right? So to make a time that's very clear that you're here to receive just conversation, people say that that's very powerful, and also just positions you as more approachable. Calling for contributions is another leadership method that I really like to see. So for example, one thing that I did for many years at my camp was before we would have a staff meeting. So we had like a big all staff meeting 3 times a summer. Like 3 days before, I'd be like, okay, everyone, remember on Saturday, we have an all staff meeting. I'd love to hear what folks would like to see on the agenda, right? So like a 3-day warning, maybe a 2-day warning, and a 1-day warning. Like, hey, come talk to me if there's anything you want to bring up at the staff meeting, and we can see if we can get it on the agenda, right? So kind of in a proactive way, giving people a chance to make announcements, bring up concerns, start conversations, can be really helpful, especially if we're kind of tagging those calls for contributions onto things that are already on our calendar, right? Or, hey, before session 2 starts, if you have any thoughts about, cabin placements, what's working, what's not, make sure you talk to me by tomorrow at noon. And remember, I have office hours from 8 to 8:30 on Stone Porch every morning. So that'd be a great time to let me know if you have any concerns, right? Or any ideas, might even be a better way to phrase it. I also love seeking individualized input before and after new things. So let's say like Juliet is a counselor at our camp, and Juliet's like very into safety, and I'm about to change the fire drill. I just know Juliet's like a safety dork. Everyone has those people at their camp, right? Who are like kind of more into safety than others. And so if I'm pondering changing the fire drill thing, I might find Juliet like a week before and be like, hey, this is an idea I have, or this is something I'm on my mind. Like, what are your thoughts around this, right? So I might choose like 3 or 4 or 10 people that I talk to before I institute something new. And this does 2 things. This gives me a chance to get feedback before I have a lot of stake in actually making a change, right? And so I might get some really good ideas. And it's a lot easier for me to get input from people if I ask for it, because I don't feel as vulnerable, right? Like, I'm not on defense immediately if I'm out asking for it. And I'm also building some capital around the idea, right? So if I know Juliet's like really into safety and would be the first one to complain if a new fire drill situation like wasn't great, but I can talk to her in advance and kind of in a one-on-one way, almost lobby for her to be on the side of the new idea, especially if I've taken in her input. she's more likely to be like a good grassroots advocate on the ground for the future change, and also explain, so provide further transparency behind the change that's about to be made, right? Instead of just like talking with just my co-director and making the change, I'm going to talk with people that maybe have kind of that social capital on camp, who might have big feelings around a change, and who might have really good input to share. Okay. Questions about that or comments? Okay. The next point here from a leadership skills standpoint is to ask really specific questions. So, and I also said individualized input after new things is really good too. So there's a few things you could do after new things. So let's say we did the new fire drill the next morning at staff meeting, maybe I debrief it, but I'm going to get more feedback that is more useful if I choose a few people to ask in an individualized way. Maybe I ask the counselor of the youngest cabin, because maybe I think they might have more big feelings about fire drills than the 12-year-olds or something like that. And then I also want to ask really specific questions. So I can ask, like, how did the new fire drill thing go for your kids? But it might be better to say, hey, did you notice any change in homesickness, related to doing the fire drill earlier than we would typically do it, right? And so that's going to give me more insights, and also makes feedback more useful because it's on a really clear decision point, instead of like, oh, I didn't like it, it sucked, or like, oh, I loved it, it was great, right? So if we think about what really are we trying to figure out, then specific questions can help us. Okay, and then the kind of fourth leadership skill or fifth leadership skill here is to make a semi-scary mindset shift, which is staff giving you feedback means that they care, and also means that you are approachable as a leader, right? So I think a lot of camp directors, like if someone comes in and says, I want to give you some feedback on this, or has a complaint, they think, gosh, like this sucks, this is annoying, this staff member doesn't get it, that sort of stuff. But in reality, if they give you feedback, it means perhaps that they're paying attention, they care about the health of the program or the kids, they want to make it better. And it means that you are approachable enough to receive that feedback. So like Kate said, the former directors might not have gotten as much feedback because there was, maybe more of a divide, or feedback wasn't as culturally acceptable. But I think a lot of times, like our middle managers or our newer directors, program directors, unit leaders get a lot more feedback because staff perceive you to be more understanding with it, empathetic, approachable. And that's really a good thing. It's just figuring out what to do with it. That can be a little bit tricky. All right, everybody hanging in there? Great, thank you. All right, so let's talk about some very discrete meaning, like clear and individual, not discrete, like quiet, feedback strategies. Here are some 3-minute feedback tricks. So feedback doesn't have to be a big deal. You don't have to like set aside a feedback meeting, right? Getting feedback on the agenda at all your meetings is really important. I often talk about having an agenda for all your meetings, right? Like if we don't have an agenda, what's the point of the meeting? An agenda could look like this. It could be just a Post-it note or an index card with everything that you're going to hit. But if I'm having like a quick staff huddle, the afternoon after the fire drill, maybe I include like, a little bit of feedback on the fire drill on that agenda, so I don't forget about it, right? And you can do this in different ways. It doesn't have to be like, I'm going to like make myself completely vulnerable and say like, how is my leadership to the group? And then like hear what they have to say back. We can do it in different ways. So one of the feedback techniques that I really like to use, and maybe some of you have seen it before, it's a very simple facilitation technique called Fist of 5. And so you can just ask people to use their fingers to score something. So I could say something to the group like, hey, we did the new fire drill system. this morning. I want to know how it went for you and your kids. Give me a 0 if it was absolutely the worst. Give me a 5 if it went great. 4, 3, 2, 1 if it's something in the middle, right? So I could start off my conversation like that. I can even ask people to close their eyes and vote with a secret ballot. Maybe the fire drill wasn't that popular of a decision, but if we do secret ballot and I get a lot of 5s, I know most people are on board with it, and a couple of 0s are my more vocal dissenters, right? So I can use Fist of 5 for all sorts of different things. I often use Fist of 5 in facilitation for like little bits of feedback. So say we're doing a group discussion and I don't know how much more time the group members need. I've got 10 groups of 5 in the room. I'm not going to exactly figure out what's going on. So I might ask everyone to close their eyes and show me with their fingers from 0 to 10 how many more minutes they want to discuss in that group. How much more time in your group do you need? Okay, I need 2 more minutes. Sometimes you get a group and one person says I need 10 more minutes and one person says I need 0 more minutes. And then you think to yourself, okay, I'm going to keep an eye on this group because things are kind of weird over there. But that's an instance of feedback, like asking people what they need instead of just making the judgment call on your own. If you've been with me in-person sessions before, I know many of you have. I use the index card trick a lot, which I learned from one of my professors at University of Michigan, Jane Dutton, and she passes out index cards at the end of each of her class, and she asks people to write a plus sign on the front of the index card and write something that's been going well. And then she asks people to write like a minus sign or a delta to represent change, or a question mark on the back of the index card to share something that's not going so well, or something they'd like to see changed, or something they still are wondering about or have a question about, and then collect those as people leave. So it's a great way to kind of just get like little nuggets of feedback and make quick adjustments. You can also ask people to sign their names on these instances of feedback. I think people are more likely to write things that are helpful and not overly bold or cruel if it's attached to their name. And you can always turn these index cards into raffle tickets for, something fun later on, right? So feedback just becomes kind of like another campy thing, another thing we do on a regular basis. I'd much rather know that a bunch of my counselors have a lot of lingering questions about homesickness the afternoon after the session than in like the middle of session 1 of camp when a bunch of kids are crying and no one knows what to do, right? So thinking about how do we start these little kind of feedback hacks right away is important. Shout out style is really easy too. So let's say you have a staff training huddle and, oh, okay, wait, hold on. Rosie, what's the thumb thermometer? Is that just like it's going well?
It's like a similar thing to 1 through 5, but you choose where you are on it.
Great. It's just like a little scale.
Yeah.
I love that it's called the thumb thermometer.
Some people can be like, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Really familiar with it.
Perfect. Thank you. So in my staff huddle, let's say it's the morning after our camp out activity, right? And so I might just say, okay, like everybody huddle up. What's something that worked really well for you last night at camp out? And I like take a couple of comments from the group. What's something that was challenging for you? What's something that you think you want to do differently, or you'd like to see us do differently as a group next time camp out rolls around, right? So I'm still cultivating that culture of one possible solution. I'm still getting little nuggets of feedback. My staff are learning from each other and can kind of help each other if problems come up. And then if I'm noticing patterns or a lot of nods of agreement on something that's challenging, then I can think about, or I can work with my staff to think about possible solutions so we don't have that same kind of consensus around challenging things going forward. I also want to emphasize that feedback isn't always negative. Oftentimes when we think about feedback, we get in this kind of immediate assumption that it's going to be something critical. Putting positive feedback tricks into agendas of staff meetings, staff training is really helpful too. I will send this out. I have a blog about, I'm just going to write it down because I have awesome systems about, that was funny. Nobody else pick up on that. I have a blog about ways that you can put staff appreciation into your staff meetings. And one of the activities I like to do is the staffle. So I give every staff member in the meeting 3 blank index cards, and I ask them to write a shout out on each index card or a gratitude to a person on their team. So I might write, Rosie did this, and Drew really helped me with this homesick camper, and Lindy has been a really safe lifeguard, and I, really appreciate it when we're on duty at the same time, whatever. And then those 3 index cards become raffle tickets that all go into like a big bin. And then at the staff meeting, I can pull those raffle tickets out and read the gratitude, and then that person gets to select a prize. And that's a way to collect a ton of positive feedback. It gives you a lot of insight in terms of who's doing what, how people are relating to each other, who's really thriving and doing well, who can you coach at a certain thing they're already good at to help them be even better, or to fill in on camp where, there's a deficit or more help is needed. So thinking about how do we collect feedback on a regular basis that isn't just complaint feedback is a really helpful asset to culture as well. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts about that? Okay, great. Oops. A couple other feedback techniques we've been talking about. I think QR codes are really useful. So codes that people can scan with their phones to access surveys. Feedback doesn't happen when, like written feedback doesn't happen when the inquiries are too long or too cumbersome, or like get in the way of all the other things that counselors have to do. But I just talked to a day camp director who's going to have a QR code right by the time clock at her camp. So before people punch out for the day, they just need to take their phone, scan the QR code, and there's a 1 to 2 minute Google form about their day's experiences at camp, right? So they're still on the clock. It's very quick. It's attached to another habit that they're doing. Because when we want to create a new habit, there needs to be a cue, it needs to be part of the routine, and there needs to be a reward associated with that. So they can scan the QR code, they get maybe 3 questions, what went well today, what got messed up, or what did you hope will be better? Is there anything we need to know about your campers or the group dynamic, right? And so maybe the answer is no for the last question. That's fine. Maybe there's something longer, but if we get in the habit of doing this, we have a line of communication. We can get to problems before they get too big, and we get all staff giving feedback because it's part of their expectation, instead of just like the 10% of feedback that are going to say, the 10% of staff that are going to say the thing. I also think that having an experience evaluation form that staff can fill out a third of the way through their summer experience is really useful. We might call this like a midsummer self eval. But can we have some time for staff to dive a little bit deeper into their own experience and fill out some greater reflection on how it's going for them specifically? That's always been very useful to me, and it kind of demonstrates that we're caring about people as individuals when we're able to read those and respond to them. Perhaps if we're doing like a midsummer sit down or evaluation with staff, we want to get their insights as well as our observations into that midsummer evaluation. I also think changing staff meetings where like the directors sit at the front and like, yeah, sure, maybe everyone gets like pizza rolls or something, but then the directors like read a list of announcements into something that's more like a facilitated workshop is going to be really valuable. So an example of this would be maybe at a staff meeting, we still have announcements, but then we break for 20 minutes and there's posters around the room with 6 different things that are challenging this summer. And we instead do a gallery walk where staff can walk up to the poster with the challenge that they think they have the best ideas to solve and brainstorm with others things that camp could do to make this particular situation better, right? So instead of the staff meeting being like, yeah, we're having a big problem with camper mental health, maybe the staff meeting is about possible solutions around having a healthier environment, for campers' mental health, right? And we're going to work on that for 20 minutes instead of listening to the director give announcements about how we need better supervision, better communication with each other. right? So if we think about what part of a staff meeting can be more facilitated and can be soliciting input in a generative way from our staff, feedback just gets more productive and useful and on the agenda, instead of like, someone's going to come in once it gets really bad and like drop a bunch of bombs. Although I don't like saying drop a bunch of bombs, I need a better phrase for that. A lot of my idioms lately have been really rubbing me the wrong way. But you know what I mean by that. Someone's going to come in with a bunch of like midsummer disastrous surprises that there's nothing you can do about. Okay. So why for you as a camp leader might it be hard sometimes to receive staff feedback?
I'll say that this is something that I've really been working on. I'm actually just stepping back into the camp world from 7 years in public education. And I used to be like really protective of my practice, right? Like I feel like teaching is an art and I really like how I do it. And someone coming to say like, hey, you're doing this really well. Here's something that like I'm getting reports from kids on that like they're not really jiving with what you're doing. So I've kind of been like coaching myself and I feel like I'm better at it now of just like being wrong and being okay with being wrong, because it helps you like be better, and that doesn't like define you as a person or like your expertise in the area. It's only going to help you grow. So it's hard because a lot of times that feedback is like, you can be doing this in a different or better way, and kind of letting go of the expectations that like what I'm doing is right.
Yeah.
Because there's all multiple rights. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I often think of like, sometimes I say camp is my firstborn, right? Like I put so much into it. It really felt like my child. And it did get very personal, and like someone complaining about like my camp or the way I was running it would be the same as I'm like calling my kid ugly or misbehaved or something like that. It was like beyond just like marks on a paper or, something that was more straightforward. It did feel very personal to me. Yeah, Rosie writes, a lot of staff are personal friends or former campers, so it can feel like a break or change in trust in their relationship with me. When we work at camp, these interactions are personal in a way that they aren't in any other workplace, right? Or maybe then you have to go to bed at night and they like literally sleep above you in a bunk, right? like great, like I just had like an awkward feedback situation and they're my roommate, or I'm like brushing my teeth next to them moments later. Like there's really no escape from it if you're in an overnight camp, especially when someone's disgruntled with you or kind of gives you feedback that maybe stings. Any other thoughts on this question? Just like recognizing that it is hard sometimes. Kate, were you going to say something? Did I cut you off?
Yeah, I was gonna just agree with Rosie too. Definitely like that speaks to me. And also feeling like I need to fix everything. Like someone comes to me with a problem and then like really needing to work on, like I need to work on unlearning. Like I don't have to have all the solutions, and that actually isn't gonna be the most helpful. It's like more people will learn more and grow more if it can be collaborative and if they can have some ownership over kind of solution-oriented thinking.
Yes. I oftentimes say, I say this, not oftentimes, I say this like every day when I'm doing camp staff training. So I think all of you have heard me say this before, is asking yourself, is it an emergency? Right? Because like a lot of things at camp come up and it feels like an emergency, but it's really just like a fake emergency, or it's urgent, or yeah, you're right. Like it's going to be a better long run solution if we don't handle it, and the director is going to swoop in and handle it in an emergency way. And I think feedback can be hard because a lot of times it does feel like an emergency, but it's actually not, right? Or it feels higher stakes than it really is. And the other thing that has really helped me a lot is no matter what, like when I walk into a room to do a presentation or lead a camp or whatever I'm doing, like a certain percentage of the people just aren't going to like me, right? Like it's just not a fit. Like it's fine. Like one or two of you probably don't like me, and there's nothing I can do or change to like make that different. It's just what it is. And that kind of just goes back to people pleasing, right? But just kind of like letting go of the fact that like not everyone's going to understand or agree with your leadership, but being confident enough to not accept all feedback is I think like more advanced leadership, right? Instead of thinking like, wow, like all feedback is valid, or I have to respond to all of these requests in a certain way. All right, so here are some of my pieces of advice. So the first one is to remember your own self-intent and have self-compassion, right? So I talk a lot about positive intent, like nobody signed up to work at the camp because they wanted to ruin it, right? Or, make things bad. And that includes you. So when things go wrong or there's some negative feedback, it's not because you like deliberately messed it up or you're a bad person. It's probably because you had a resource, skills, or time deficit, or an understanding deficit, and just couldn't do it in the best possible way. So remembering that if someone makes an accusation to you, a staff member, a parent, whoever, that you're the worst. I have a friend who's a camp director, and she shared in the anonymous feedback box last summer that someone wrote like, who even hired insert director name for this position. And I know this person, they're an extraordinarily competent camp director. I would work for them, send my child to their camp, any of the things, but someone was just having a really hard time and said something really hurtful directed at them. Right. So it's tricky not to internalize it, but remembering that you came in with positive intent, and having self-compassion for the fact that, one piece of negative feedback probably is balanced by 1,000 pieces of positive feedback, is helpful too. I think having someone read feedback for you or with you is really important. So Jack, who co-founded Summer Camp Society, and I do this all the time. It's really helpful. Like we go through feedback together, because we have different perspectives. And if someone gives some feedback that's like unfair or difficult, he's really good at saying like, well, that doesn't make sense, and here's why. If it's something that I did, or that, hey, that does make sense, like let's think about it. But kind of like providing that interpretation or perspective at like just like another level of cushion around feedback is really powerful. Or screening feedback, right? So people are weird and say weird things on all sorts of things that they might submit. And maybe having someone read the feedback first and give you some themes is better than you reading it and seeing a few mean things that might really stick with you, right? So maybe that's another director in your group. Maybe that's a colleague that works at a different camp that can kind of read through feedback with a unbiased viewpoint and then kind of prepare it for you. But not reading feedback like by yourself on your phone at 11 p.m. like the first time the survey result comes in is helpful. Like have a plan for not just soliciting the feedback, but receiving it, and not doing it alone is what I'd advise here. Any comments or questions about that? Okay. Communicate to a leadership team ally when you're not in the mood for feedback, right? So maybe you've had a hard day, maybe you're in like a fragile place, maybe something's going on at home. Maybe today is not the day when you want, a counselor to come up to you and approach you about something that's gone wrong. Can someone kind of like run interference and intercept some of the comments on a given day? Or if you're not in a good place and you think if you get feedback, you might snap or do something that you regret or damage a relationship, sometimes you're not the right person to respond to some feedback either. Maybe if the change of the fire drill is very high stakes to you, important to you, it's your baby, you're very committed to it. Maybe a colleague is a better person to receive feedback and then like package that to you, so you don't start like hating on the person just because they disagreed with your idea, right? So again, not doing this in isolation is important. Having boundaries around anonymous feedback, I think, is pretty critical. I think a lot of us want to be like tough and open to feedback, so we do things like feedback boxes and that sort of thing. I know I'm like 6 months late or 2 years late to this, but I just watched Ted Lasso. Has Has anyone else seen it? And they have like an anonymous question box in the show for the football team, the soccer team. If you haven't watched it, it's great. Very campy. Anyway, and like all the anonymous feedback in one of the first episodes, out of this question box the coach opens, it's like calling him mean names. Like every single comment is mean. And I just think about like our local newspaper. This might seem like a stretch, but this is how I relate it. Our local newspaper used to have comments at the bottoms of articles, and people could have like whatever name they wanted, like soccer girl 94 or something. And then they could like write whatever they wanted about the news article, right? And it just got so mean. Like they had to turn it off because there was no accountability around the feedback that was given. And I think that's what like an anonymous question box is. So I think having a lot of opportunities for anonymous feedback can be really tricky and risky and doesn't breed the culture of one possible solution. And I think some very intentional elements of anonymous feedback are really important, but these need to be planned out. It is important because people might fear like retaliation, or people might face discrimination for elements of their identity, and they need to be able to speak up without, concerns about like retribution or, but if something is going wrong and you are being a mean boss and you treat, one gender differently or something like that, like you need to know that, and people need to be able to report that in a safe way. But that should all be like very structured and developed with HR, and not in a way where you just have like a question box where someone in like a bad mood can like take you down and like break your little camp director heart. Do y'all agree with that? Do you have questions or comments about finding the balance with anonymous feedback?
I just think it's interesting that it's almost like it's dangerous to have it and dangerous to not have it. So I think that's what you mean by like having boundaries around that anonymous feedback is there are obviously times where it's necessary, which is what you were just talking about. And at the same time, a lot of times you receive feedback and you want to know more, or like it's a sentence and you're like, this is really important. I have no idea where it's coming from.
Right.
And I think like I would just add to that that's a part where being approachable and having that relationship to have an honest and hard conversation, so you can be like, thanks for putting your name on this.
Right.
I'm really happy you felt comfortable telling me. I need to know a little bit more, like in what context and area of our programming, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important, Lindy. And I would also add that making sure all of your leadership team is really kind of spouting out this approachability, this, we want your feedback, we want you to come to us, is critical. If we have leadership team members of many different identities represented, many different personalities represented, maybe I'm not that comfortable, at Camp Echo coming to Lindy, but I am comfortable with Bernard, right? So thinking about, okay, or I'm comfortable with Bernard's baby. So, but thinking about maybe there's 6 different people you could go to for feedback. And we're making that announcement about the fire drill. Hey, if you have anything to share about the fire drill, I'm spearheading the effort, but I'm also, getting help and input. So come to any of these 5 representatives on camp, come to one of the head counselors, come to the program director, come to the health officer, and share anything you have, on your mind, instead of like, you have to come to me. Well, maybe I'm the scariest person on camp and I just don't know it. So thinking about what are other avenues that people can approach, maybe take some of the, take some of the power of anonymous feedback if you can come to other people about it. Also, a lot of camps don't like articulate HR support that they have. And I think that's like pretty messed up. And I'm not going to solve that today, but like, what do you have, what if someone's a whistleblower? What if someone has a sexual harassment situation? What are the protocols for that at camp? And a lot of the anonymous feedback is really around more high stakes matters than like when the fire drill is, right? And so I guess that's what I'm talking about too with anonymous feedback. Like if it's so important that it has to be anonymous, it's probably not a really important topic, and it needs to be done not just like with me and Google, right? Like I need to bring in a lawyer, someone knows more about HR, to really put some protocols in place around things that are about safety, right? Or discrimination, which is actually safety at the same time. Okay, we talked about this from the very beginning, but it's not possible to take all the feedback, and you know your camp the most. Like at this point in time, sometimes you have more, actually most of the time, you have more perspective on all of the different decision points that go into whether or not we're going to do something at camp. So saying no is okay, and being transparent with the reasons behind the no is okay too, and important. But your feedback also matters, right? And just because the loudest person gave certain feedback doesn't mean it's the right feedback. One of the techniques I learned from my friend and colleague at University of Michigan, who was one of my professors, Paula Caproni, is oftentimes feedback conversations are anchored around the boldest or first person that speaks, right? So if I ask a group of 10 camp counselors, what do you think about the new fire drill policy? This is not true, but let's say Drew's kind of like a bully on the staff team, and Drew says right away, like, it made my campers really upset. I really despised it. That sets the whole tone for the conversation. It would be better if I had 10 counselors present to give all the counselors an index card and say, what are, 3 observations you have about the new fire drill protocol? And then ask everyone to read out their observations after they're written, instead of having the first person verbally anchor the conversation around their opinion. Do you see how that might work or help? Right. So you can't take all the feedback, but the more voices you get into the mix, the better perspective that you have. And also weighing your own voice more than others is okay, because you have a perspective that summer staff don't have, because you're in it in a deeper way, right? Like in some ways, you're like the parent, right? That doesn't mean that you have to dominate or other opinions are invalid, but it does mean that you can give that greater perspective that you have a little more weight, and you shouldn't have to feel like terribly guilty about it all the time, especially if you get other folks who also have greater perspective, your supervisors, peers that work at different camps but have similar situations, or your leadership team to also weigh in. Okay. So one of my last questions here is, what feedback fears that we didn't address do you have going into the summer? Any?
That there'll be staff from a previous summer who will be like, we told you we didn't like this, but you're still doing it.
Yeah.
That's messed up.
Yeah. And are those challenges that you anticipate that they'll already, like, you already know that they're going to be mad about X, Y, or Z?
Some of those stuff are not coming back. So I'm like curious if any of those opinions will like remain in other people that I'm like less aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely interesting. Thinking about one-on-one conversations that we can have before staff get to camp can be helpful too, right? Like we might know the 5 or 6 people that we think might be especially vocal about something that they were mad about last year, but still hasn't changed. And to meet with them in advance and like tell them now, so they don't get the news when other people are watching them, or when they have an opportunity to like be dramatic and talk to everyone else about it, can be really powerful. Thoughts on that for Rosie, or other fears or questions that the group has?
I was gonna say another fear
Sure.
that I have is we have quite a lot of new staff starting who've never been to camp before, and my concern is that they're going to sort of their expectations of what camp is like might sort of be defied, and that they'll start complaining about things that are kind of just natural to the job or just sort of part and parcel to camp that could maybe be changed, but are like sort of bigger things that are more difficult to overcome, and that this might sort of like make it difficult for them to sort of get on board with the job if it's not exactly what they're expecting because they're so
Yeah.
new to it.
Yeah, for sure. I remember my first summer working as a counselor at camp for the whole summer. I found out like on day 5 that I'd have to clean the giant bathhouse in our village once a week. Like, 8 showers, 12 toilets, 10 sinks, like wasn't in the job description, wasn't in the interview, and like call me a brat. But I was like, what? Like I didn't sign up to clean the communal bathhouse once a week. And I was like kind of ticked about it. It turned out that it was fine and it was fun. And I got darn good at cleaning a giant bathhouse throughout the course of the summer because it was a positive part of the camp culture. But I point that out as a leadership example because it would have been so much more genuine and ethical for the director to tell me that was coming in my paperwork, right? Like that should have been in the job description. I think if some of us aren't doing the interviewing and the hiring, we could notice a disconnect between the actual expectations that someone might have in the sales process of maybe our directors trying to get people to sign up for the job and the reality of what the job is. And no matter how well we prepare people, weird things happen at camp. You might get a camper that's like tremendously difficult or a really stormy season, or something that we couldn't have possibly prepared you for. But it'd be interesting to see if you are in the middle, like what disconnects you do notice and how that can be articulated to the people who are doing the hiring. So they could make those changes, if not for summer 2022, for summer 2023. I'd rather have people quit on me. I know this is a sensitive subject right now, but I'd rather have people quit on me in April or May than in July. Right. So that kind of idea of no surprises is in line with the feedback. Okay.
This is something that I always wonder about. We talk about like too much feedback and wanting people to feel like they are being heard and then not having the time or capacity to make sure that they are heard or changes are made. And then like the fear of like really good, important things are being brought to us and it's a lot of it. And then it's like hard to figure out like what to choose. So I guess my question or thought is, how do you receive feedback in a way that isn't overwhelming? And then how do you choose like what to act on? Is it just like what feels right? Is it like, I also think like some people, a certain group can bring things to you regularly and that you're more apt to like communicate and serve them than another group because it's easier. That's a lot of information, a lot of like topics, but any like thoughts around the area? Because I'm trying to like do it well, maybe not right. There's multiple rights, but do it well.
It is so tricky too, because you don't want to be that like stereotypical organization that has to have like a meeting about their meeting, right? Like part of me is like, okay, we get the feedback and then we need feedback on the feedback. That's kind of messed up, right? But if we take in a lot of feedback, can we process it as a leadership team and then come back to the staff with, like, let's say the staff feedback is we need more time for self-care. Well, we can't do all the things, but we could work on one of the following projects. There's 5 projects: adjusting night off, giving more relief during activity periods, increasing ratios or decreasing ratios, whatever. Maybe there's 5. We have the resources to do one of these. Can we let our staff do like a quick vote via text, on or rank order on a Mentimeter, like which one of these is most important to you, so I guess that is a dance between how do you gauge the importance of what feedback comes in, and how do you move enough on it so that your reaction matters before it's too late, because the summer is so short. But being able to say to folks, like, I hear you, we want to work on that. And I'm going to tell you right now, so you don't have the wrong expectation that that's like a 2023 solution, right? Like it's important. We recognized it in 2022, and we're not going to come up with a solution that is sustaining if we try to push something through really quickly. So let's spend the rest of the summer doing research and then convene in September and October so we can make a lasting change for 2023 and beyond, right? And I think that's like a
I-
reasonable approach as well.
I like that a lot. I'm, I've only been in this office and position for like a week or two, and I've
Yeah.
already heard a lot of that. Like, this was brought to our attention last summer, didn't have the capacity.
Yeah.
We're already on it this summer, which like shows the amount of work that happens in between seasons, right? And the importance of that. And I guess that's like one of my biggest fears is wanting to receive feedback, but also not wanting to, because not having like the knowledge or skills to be able to act on it. So that is super helpful to like think this is something we have to act on. And then this is something that I'm taking in my really all important notes of things to work on in the fall to be better next summer. And thanks for
Yeah.
bringing that.
And
Cool.
looping
Thank you.
looping staff in the fall too
Mhm.
is great. Or having like a big visual board that says like 2023 and beyond, like things we're working on, right? So it's not like, oh, well, like Lindy
I
just
love
like
that.
wrote it down on like a Post-it note and we're never going to see it again. Something that's like really a visual accountability.
Like a 2023 vision board.
Yes, that'd be cool. Yeah, collage it up there. Yeah, and I think people do understand that like a quick fix isn't the answer here. If someone comes to you and has a concern about like gender inclusive housing at camp, it's really important and it's somewhat complicated. It has to do with like facility and like human hearts and identity and all these things. Like, I'm not going to come up with a great solution if I have to do it in the morning. Like, yes, anything that involves safety or a person sitting before me is really important. And to make a sustaining change in system, I really need to work on that for a few months, right? And like literally build some stuff, or change infrastructure. And so it's important enough that it's a bigger project than a magic wand, right?
That's so timely. We were just talking about our young people are the leaders in change right now. They see something that they're like, that's wrong or that's right, and I'm all in. And that can come out in a way that like, is so inclusive that it's exclusive, or and kind of coaching through like the timeline of what the change you want is, I think, super powerful to be like, how you're feeling is great. And that energy is going to be a long-term energy. It's not going to be like, we're not making the change for the holiday in 72 hours, but we are going to expend that energy and that knowledge through the year. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So my last question for the group is if you have a micro goal. So this is something like a nugget from today that either you heard or you thought of throughout the last hour or so that you think you want to try this summer. Anything that's kind of like a low-hanging fruit or something that you think would be like pretty easy to institute.
I was thinking about how you said about the sort of like louder voices that jump in first.
Yeah.
And something I've done in the past outside of camp in like other roles is just sort of choosing a quieter voice to go first, kind of setting a precedent that there's not one counselor that talks for everyone. And I kind of want to make sure that I do that in meetings, maybe just not making people feel called out, but just sort of like directing the conversation towards someone that I haven't heard from in a bit and seeing what their thought is first before going to sort of, I guess, the person who jumps in as the representative who kind of is really enthusiastic, and that's good as well, but just hearing from someone else first, because I feel like that representative sometimes can twist other people's words and sort of collect they'll go around being like, don't you feel badly about this? You should feel badly about this, and kind of convince everyone. Just seeing like what the reality is from other people before you jump to, I guess, what would the word for that be? Like the
squeaky wheel. Another trick, Julia, that I really like is maybe we're having a discussion around a problem. I ask people to get in partners or partner them up and say, discuss. And then when I reconvene the group, I say, okay, whose partner said something that you think the rest of the group should hear, right? So then they kind of filter for each other, and you have to raise your hand, but to share someone else's idea. So it's not a race to really be like, who's the smartest in the room. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Rosie notes more index card notes during staff training, and noting that counselors can use some of these strategies for getting feedback from campers, which is awesome too. Yeah, just like carrying around a bunch of index cards all the time, right? I would love some of these index cards from campers as well. Like, what's going really well for you this session? Like, what questions do you have? Would be really interesting. Really, really interesting. Great. Okay. Any other micro goals or thoughts? Those are good ones.
I'm excited about the transparency aspects that you shared, and sort of just stating outright, like, like expectations around what people can expect that we're able to share, and we're not able to share anything that'll help alleviate kind of conflict later in the summer.
Yeah, it's not personal that I can't tell you why this person was fired. Like, it's really the law. That's helpful. Good. Well, I have a credit slide. Drew is on this credit slide because he was part of an early conversation about this topic. But these are folks that are members of the Summer Camp Society who engaged in an early conversation about this when I was writing. So I wanted to send a special thanks to them for working on this with me. So a few things upcoming. We're having staff training talks every weekday at noon Eastern on the Summer Camp Society's Instagram. So we're interviewing different interesting people across the industry about their best tips for staff training. So love to see folks view the archive or join us live for those. And we have more Power Pack stuff coming up this week and next week. So hopefully we'll see many of you and your colleagues for those experiences. And I'll get together some resources to go along with the recording and send it out to you within the next week or so you can reference back to it. So I can stick around if there's any other questions or concerns, but otherwise it was great to see so many of you, and thanks for spending your Monday afternoon with me on the internet.
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, everybody.
I'll stop the recording now too.